So, to give context, I didn't believe in Wendigos or anything supernatural like that growing up, due to my upbringing as a Jehovah's Witness. I didn't scare easily, save especially when it came to dark, until that one morning. I was about 10 when my parents wanted me to visit my uncle for a couple of weeks in the winter and help him around his property. I, of course, complied, just moments after the promise of otter pops and chilling out with my uncle. My uncle's house was wedged between Madras and Warm Springs, and he had a couple of neighbors just within earshot of the property. So it wasn't entirely isolated. But I hadn't realized that I'd get stuck with the chore of throwing a couple of flakes of hay to his horses every morning after the first couple days. And so by morning, it was more or less a bit before 6, and it was very dark. So, the 5th morning, I came out to fling hay over the fences, and I get spooked by the sound of geese flopping about. I had to take a quick pause and gather myself as I continued to distribute the hay. Weirdly enough, I noticed the horses had not come any closer to munch the hay that they usually whine for. They just stayed huddled together in the shed, making it impossible to tell which is the other. Then, to my delayed horror, I noticed one of the two horses came galloping over from the other side of the area to prey upon the hay that usually they consume with much glee. I looked back at the shed as the horses began moving together. It didn't feel any way natural to see two horses moving so forcibly like that. It was a good enough reason to book it out of there already, but me and my dense skull had already decided to throw the last 2 flakes before booking it back to the house. Then, the frozen morning dew being crushed inside the pen had already caught my gaze, and I felt like my heart had stopped. I had witnessed the 2 horses huddled together, twisting in such a way that they were sprinting as one thing towards me, and before I knew it, my legs were now making a full sprint to the back door of the house. I kept hearing the sounds of not broncos galloping, but the thumping of hands or feet, crushing the frozen cheatgrass. I'd like to know what you guys think, and what this could have been. I mean, this may have been something I've never dealt with before. It has been a decade now since, and I still hear that noise in my nightmares. What should I do? I was 7 years old, which is not too long ago. I had a habit of talking to myself while walking around outside. In fact, I could spend all day outside, or even stay outside all night, without ever getting scared or anything, until this one day. I was walking outside doing my everyday thing. The entire property was covered in woodlands, surrounding the house and the long driveway that leads to the road. Nothing but giant woods, actually. And the woods were so big, you can go to the top of the driveway, look at the overview of the woods, just extending miles and miles out. When I was going to the side of the house to the door that leads underneath the house, I heard walking and crying. So naturally, I walked over to where it was, shining my flashlight at the noises, and I wish I would have immediately ran, hearing those noises, then looking at the thing. What I saw was easily the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. The thing was a bluish pale with a greenish white glowing eyes. It was as tall as a doorway, the skin stretching so tight over the thing that I could see the veins and bones. The hands were the size of a dinner plate, and the fingers very bony and long. Its face was behind a bush, so I couldn't see it well, but I could make out a little. It began moving its head around, trying to look at me. The way it moved around unsettled me so bad, so I just stood still in fear, trying to process what was looking at me. It stopped moving, and it crouched down like a frog, getting ready to hop. The face of this thing is what unsettled me the most. Its face had an angry, really angry expression, and the teeth were sharp. It had more teeth than I can honestly count. Long, sharp teeth, big, bulging, glowing eyes, angry expression, and no nose. Just two small holes. It was the perfect combination of a face of a creature you should never mess with. I screamed so loud it was kind of scared by me, but still seemed interested in what I thought was it wanting to disembowel me. I ran to the back porch, which was pretty far away, but I was determined. I ran faster than normal, and I was already out of breath. But having a very sore cramp is way more better than being torn apart. I ran onto the back porch, busting through the door, slamming it shut. The first thing I did was lock it, run to my room, cry, and cower under my bed, staying up all night, and never going outside again at night after that. Look, I've never seen the thing ever again, but I can't go outside alone in the day. But at night, no one unless the entire military guarding the perimeter would make me do that. My parents did not buy my story. But my brother? Well, he's crazy when a subject comes to Wendigos, and he believes me. Honestly, I don't know if it's a crawler or a Wendigo or what. Please, help me. Help me understand what I saw. To preface, I was born and raised in Arizona, and I am very mindful and fascinated by the general Navajo culture. I do not speak on Skinwalkers often, out of respect for the very real fear and activity that's highly cultivated by discussing them. Anyway, on to the story. I live in an apartment with my roommate. We're not religious. Actually, we're both ex-Catholic, but are very into spirituality in a spiritual realm. She's been struggling with rejecting toxic and parasitic people in her life, and was actually in a deep meditation before basically falling asleep, reflecting on how to expel intrusive thoughts caused by hateful people. She sees two entities while in this meditation. Went to sleep, wakes up around midnight in a sleep paralysis to see a black entity in her room staring at her. Now, on my side of the apartment, I didn't know what was going on, or any of this was even happening. So I fell asleep around 11:30, slipped into a lucid dream paralysis-like state, which is not really common for me. My room looked exactly the same as it did when I fell asleep. In the dream, my roommate opens the door, sits on my bed to try and soothe me during this paralysis. But as she was talking, I shortly realized her voice sounded wrong. It was all choppy and robotic. It was either an entity posing as her, or it had taken total control of her body. Then this thing tried to enter me by pretending to touch my face in some false soothing manner. I could feel its fingers trying to force their way into my mouth. I was inclined to bite, but I knew I was in danger, and I was scared because it was still her body. I didn't want to hurt her hand. As soon as I felt it start to get into my mouth, I was literally shot out of the dream and instantaneously wide awake. We think the pervasive thoughts she's been experiencing for so long from toxic situations was actually cast out of her and looking for a new host. But I wouldn't accept it because of how in tune I am with her and just a general growth in confidence and awareness. Look, I know this seems crazy, but This could have been some other type of entity. I'm not sure. After much reflecting, I felt like what everybody else describes as skinwalkers, but it did seem slightly less sinister. I don't know. Almost a weak attempt at imitating my roommate to take some kind of life force from me. Shapeshifter, skinwalker, entity. I don't know. We're reeling a bit, but honestly, any thoughts are much appreciated. I'm 37, 36 at the time of this encounter, and have always been interested in things like the paranormal. I've actually had a couple of encounters and experiences that don't quite fit into the shapeshifter skinwalker bubble, so I'll talk about those elsewhere. I would just like to backtrack for a moment and emphasize that, quote-unquote, interested in the paranormal does not mean an outright believer. I mean, I'm certainly open to it, but more often than not, I'll enter a situation with a very agnostic attitude and instantly develop one of skepticism once I begin assessing and getting a chance to evaluate everything. That being said, I do love a good mystery, and don't think for a moment that people who believe in such things are lying or possibly stupid. We all have our reasons for believing what we do. I tried sending this through voicemail to Monsters Among Us a while ago, but I don't think it ever got aired. Anyway, enough backstory. Let's get to the story. I was working 1.5 jobs in 2019. The half job was an on-call assistant private investigator, and my main full-time job was a security guard. We mainly did patrols for apartments and a small handful of residential contracts. This particular event took place at 19th Avenue and Camelback, which, if you're from Phoenix, you know is a pretty shady part of town. The apartments I patrolled were just south of there. They were predominantly low-income tenants, half of whom were refugees all over the globe. The complex was well known in the area for things like theft, violence, break-ins, drug dealing, gangbanging, and so on. I liked patrolling it because I felt like I was helping people who genuinely needed it, and the vast majority of them were very grateful that I was there. I got to know many of them very well, and so we would often talk and shoot the breeze before I got any chance to start making my rounds again. One of the people I would talk to was an older native guy, who I won't name for obvious reasons. Often, he was on his balcony, getting drunk and high, things which we were supposed to report, but whatever. As long as you weren't causing any trouble or making too much disturbance, I'm not saying anything. I would usually say hi. He would say hi to me, and I arrived on post. We'd talk for a while, then I'd begin my shift. You know, I never had any real issues with the guy. He just liked listening to music, having a couple beers, and maybe having a blunt or two. Seemed like a pretty genuinely nice guy. He even had a tattoo on his chest of some Kachina doll, though I have no idea if they play into this encounter or not. Anyway, in the summer of 2019, I was doing my rounds, and right around 8:30 p.m., I hear him chanting loudly in his native language. I went to see if he was okay, as he never did this before. When I get there, he was inside, so I kept doing my patrol until I heard it again not long after. I went back inside, or back to the side of the complex where he was, and saw him, his pregnant fiancée, and his son, whom I had never met before, all coming down the stairs. He looked at me and said, "Hey, follow me." When I was walking behind them, I saw what appeared to be a giant-looking knife in the son's hand. But when we get to the parking lot, I could see it was just a very large feather, and his father had two smaller ones, maybe from a juvenile eagle. When we entered the parking lot, I saw a native woman standing there who I had kicked out earlier for being too loud and yelling at a guy who was the roommate of the native tenant. I'd seen him before and knew he lived there, but didn't know he was his roommate. You know, I don't remember what they were arguing about, at least this time. But she had her two sons with her, a 10-year-old boy and a 6-month-old baby in a stroller. They were going back and forth with each other, and the father and son began taking the feathers, rubbing them on the children's faces, while whispering in their language. The mother begins flipping out. "Don't you put that on my babies, you sicko! Get away!" And so on. I was about to step in and tell them that they need to stop, when they both stood up and said in a very guilty voice, "We aren't doing anything to hurt the baby. That's why I even brought the security guard, just to make sure everything is okay." And she replied, "He doesn't even know what's going on." Truer words could have never been spoken. So she then says this: "If you guys aren't doing anything wrong, then do it on your pregnant fiance's belly." The dad just says, "Okay," turns to his son to whisper something in his ear. Now the kid's turn to flip out, and he yells, "You're still evil. I'm half Christian, and I'm not doing this evil stuff," etc., etc., and takes off running. The dad and his fiancée yelled at him to come back. Then he takes off after him. I'm stuck there, trying to get the lady with the kids to leave, now for their own safety. Then I ran off looking for the dad and son. I didn't find them, so just assumed they had left the property, and therefore weren't my problem any longer. Not long after, I see a fresh blood trail and vomit on the sidewalk, and a knife nearby it. Walked back to the native guy's balcony, where I can now see him getting bandaged up by his fiancée, due to having a huge gash on his forehead. I called the cops. I hated doing that now, but this had turned serious. They came, I explained everything that had happened, and they knocked on his door, and of course, there was no answer. They explained to me there was nothing they could do, since this appeared to be a family issue, and the dad was attacked, didn't want to talk to them, which, it makes sense, I suppose from their point of view. So no charges were ever filed. The next day, I speak with the manager about the incident. He tells me, "Oh, you mean Mike?" Obviously not his real name. "Man, I've been keeping an eye on him. He moved here after he got let out of prison for manslaughter." If any of you are familiar with the process of becoming a skinwalker, you would know that one of the big steps to take in order to become one involves the murder of a family member. I only saw the guy a few times afterwards, and we never done of the incident again. But it was always in the back of my mind whenever I saw him. For the record, I don't personally think people can turn into coyotes or wield magical powers, and no disrespect intended to anyone. However, I do think that some people think they are capable of such things. Anyway, if someone who is more knowledgeable about these things has any ideas, I would love to hear them, particularly about the feathers and the tattoos. I knew a native guy years ago who had a specific tattoo put on him by a family member in case he ever got into prison, so he could not be recruited by the Warrior Society, which is a native prison gang. Think their version of the Aryan Brotherhood, and always wondered if they had any hand in the whole Skinwalker thing in the Southwest. I was relaxing in my bedroom, playing some video games, when I hear this howling outside my window. This is fairly average for me because I live in a bit of a secluded area that's near a city but far enough away that wild animals are around me. But what made this time different was the howling seemed a bit distorted, if that makes sense. It just sounded weird. That was enough for me to look out my window. At first, I see nothing, but when I turn on the lights outside, automatically turned on if I press a button on my phone, I see a wolf or coyote standing on its back legs with its fronts in the air. I watched for a few moments while this thing kind of walked around a bit and howled some more. At this point, I freak out, lock all the doors in the house, and called my mom and dad, who were out of the house that particular night, shopping or something. So they immediately come home, and I explain what had happened. They call the police and report a potential burglar or stalker. When they hang up, I try and convince them that that's what it actually was. But of course, in the end, they don't end up believing me. So my question for you is, what do skinwalkers generally look like? Secondly, how can I prevent a skinwalker coming near or to my house again? And third, what do I do if I see one of these things again? This took place a few years ago. I was in my late teens, driving home at around 10 p.m. This was a typical shift for me, and I was not too tired. I know what I saw. I lived somewhat out in the country, far enough to be on septic, close enough to be on the county's water system. I mean, it wasn't irregular to see wildlife at night, like elk, barn cats, deer, even occasionally dogs. I'd been living here for a few years at this point, and during this time, one particular neighbor had this really bad habit of his dog running free on the side of the road. So, I love animals. I would always pull over, call the number on his collar, and get him back to his rightful owner. So, anyway, I'm driving home, nearly 1 block and 3 turns from my house. I see this figure out of the corner of my eye. It looks like a medium-sized dog. I roll down my window, turn my music down, and start calling out to it, as I would a dog. "Hey, come here, sweetie. Come here, baby." It seemed very shy, as it refused to look at me, and its body language was very timid. I kept trying to speak sweetly to it, let it know that I was in no way a threat. It looked a little skinny, seemed to have short gray hair. I really wanted to see if I could help it, maybe find its owner, or get it somewhere safe and fed. It finally responds to my sweet talking, turns to face me, and my stomach drops. This is gonna sound crazy, but it had a human face. The best way I could describe it is like a Teletubby. You know, I really wish there was another way to describe it, for the sake of my credibility. But it had no distinctive features, and its head was still shaped like a dog. It did not make any faces, any noises, and it did not speak either. I was so surprised that I screamed and I sped off. I was so scared too because my house had a gate that I had to open, and I didn't know if it was following me or anything. I didn't look back, and it didn't appear to chase after me as I was speeding off. I feel bad about it to this day, and I wish I didn't react the way I did, but I didn't know if I was in danger. Seeing something like that, something that you just can't explain, I don't know. I really can't stress enough how it did not make any facial expressions, noises or speech, anything. I was the one going out of my way to bug it, and I was bluntly rude to it. I haven't seen it since. I wish I could change how I reacted, and I really do wonder about that all the time. So I did some internet scavenging afterwards. I haven't been able to find any experiences like it, which now makes me feel even more nuts. Maybe it was something slightly different than a skinwalker, but this is the closest lore of it that I know of. if you've had any similar experiences. I have a ton of questions. Circa 2012, I was in combat training with the Marine Corps in Southern California on fire watch one night, roughly 2 a.m., with 2 Navajo guys. We were on the subject of skinwalkers, telling stories that our grandparents or others had told us. We were all generally feeling a little creeped out, just from the atmosphere and the stories, when we hear the most distorted coyote howl any of us have ever heard. And what we could guess was about 50 yards away. It was like someone was slowing down a vinyl recording of a coyote howl with their finger. We all froze and were now stark white. We stared at each other for a bit, sweating. We finally pointed our flashlights in the direction of this distorted howl, and we all saw what looked like a coyote head sitting on a fence post. So here we are, just staring at it, in the shaky lights, absolutely silent. The head was pointed in our direction. Its eyes were open, but they didn't shine. They were just black. Finally, I say, maybe somebody found a dead coyote and put its head on the post. Sometimes, farmers will hang a dead coyote on a fence to keep other coyotes away. Our training was taking place on a large open cattle field, after all. And right after I say that, the head turns slightly to the left and moves off the post. From behind the post, this coyote walks out on its hind legs, its jaw and tongue dangling like they were broken, and then just walks off into the darkness, beyond the reach of our flashlights. We all immediately poop bricks, and we book it out of there, where everybody was sleeping, and of course proceeded to not sleep properly for the rest of our time out there. I mean, how could you? I'm telling you now, though, all 3 of us saw it, and all 3 of us know exactly what we saw. Moral of the story: speak about it, and they appear